Hello, and welcome to the Fintech Times Podcast, focused on discussing the latest fintech topics and trends from around the world. Established in 2016, the Fintech Times is a global multimedia news outlet centered around the world's first leading fintech newspaper. We report all the latest and brightest ideas from the fintech world.
So firstly, I'd like to say a hello to our online audience. Thank you so much for joining us today as we explore GameTech and its adoption of PayTech. So you can follow along the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag Fintech Times Adopt PayTech, and you can also follow us at the Fintech Times. As the gaming industry continues to experience huge growth, ways to pay both in-game and out are ever more essential. With the rise in subscription services as well as in-game items such as loot boxes and skins, making payments has become part and parcel of being a gamer. We'll look at some of the major trends in gaming PayTech adoption, as well as examine some of the factors to consider for payments processes to be successful, such as regulation and cybersecurity. It will also answer the question, why are so many payment methods required in the world of gaming? So we have some fantastic guests for today's discussion, and I am delighted to welcome on screen Mehwish Aslam, Chief Business Officer at bSecure, Ahon Sarkar, General Manager at Helix, and Ankur Banerjee, CTO at cheqd. I'm really excited for the discussion we're about to have, but I'd love to just start off by going around each of you for a short introduction to yourselves and your company. So Mehwish, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Polly, for having me over. So I'm Mehwish Aslam. I've been a part of the e-com system in Pakistan since 2019. Before that, I was a part of the Starcom Media West Group, which is related to media and advertising. So I have an experience of looking at things from a consumer perspective and the way it's packaged to understanding how the fintech and the ecosystem is working in Pakistan. Interestingly, I have two boys and my husband who are game enthusiasts. So I know a lot about gaming, and I'm really excited to be a part of this webinar.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today. Ahon, why don't you give us the next intro?
Yeah, sure. It's nice to meet you guys. My name is Ahon. I'm the general manager of Helix. We were one of the first and we're one of the largest embedded finance players in the United States. And so we basically help innovative companies build unique banking products, wallets, all that kind of stuff, and look vertical by vertical and kind of ask the question of how do we transform this vertical by adding embedded banking services. From a gaming perspective, I have been playing games since I've had a computer. So, living in the fintech world and playing in the gaming one, it's interesting to see what that intersection looks like. So excited to dive in today.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ahon. And then Ankur, could you give us an intro, please?
Absolutely. My name is Ankur Banerjee. I'm the CTO and co-founder at cheqd. We are working on mechanisms through which people can port their data and prove their identity on online platforms, and especially looking at ways in which payment mechanisms or financial incentives can be tied to that sort of data portability, which is an interesting topic, I think, in the gaming space itself. Obviously, there's been a lot of focus on whether you can have play-to-earn games, port your data, and so on. But in a previous life, I've also worked in a lot of other startups in fintech as well as in the financial services industry. So that's where my sort of payment interest and payment background comes from. And as for games, I think the closest thing that I can talk about PayTech and games is I think I've spent about £100 on virtual bananas in Minions Rush. It is probably one of the most useless but also enjoyable spends that I've spent in this space. But yeah, no, very excited about this chat today because I think there's a lot of different things that intersect between identity, gaming, and payments and fintech in general.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today. And as I was just saying before we started recording, I love doing things about GameTech because gamers are so passionate. And I feel like gaming is something that you can absolutely relate to, even if you don't necessarily know too much about fintech itself. Like everyone has played a game before. So which is why I really love this topic and I'm very excited about our conversation. So I thought let's kick off with probably a more simple question, but just to give us some context. So what is it that gamers are paying for? So why don't we, Ankur, why don't we go back to you for just to answer that question?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think gamers have, or the industry itself has moved from people being able to buy and own games and, just buying a DVD and then being able to work off it, to more of a recurring revenue model, I think, where you have subscriptions to games or game passes, which is a broad sort of move within most kinds of the entertainment industry. We see that in films, we see that in TV streaming services and music, but also in a lot of buying of in-game content. What's quite interesting in this space is initially, people would be buying games, whereas a lot of the activity right now is in customizing what your in-game experience is. And sometimes this kind of customization feels quite cosmetic. So to get back to that example of the virtual bananas or skins or outfits you can buy for your character, it's quite interesting how much people care about things like that. So it's been interesting to see an evolution over, I think, the past 2 decades, where it's gone more from owning a physical product to how do you enhance your experience and enhance your ongoing experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Ahon, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, for sure. I think as a part of that, one of the challenges that a lot of these gaming companies are trying to figure out is, how do I get mass scale up front, right, to bring people into the door? And how do I get them using the product, right? Because before, you go spend $60, you buy a game, you play that game for 20 hours and you move on, right? But now, if I can consistently drip out content, right? If I can consistently drip out new custom items that are hard to get, right? It creates scarcity, it creates interest, and the network effect that comes from a free game is really hard to replicate with paid games, right? I think the other thing that you're hearing in what Ankur is saying is that people crave personalization. I want my gaming experience to be unique, and I want my avatar in the world to be Ahon's and not just the generic character that every single person has to play. Because when I log on and I'm spending 10, 20, 100 hours playing these kinds of games, I almost take on the personality of this avatar, right? And in some ways, we were talking about this before we got on the call. In some ways, gaming is the precursor for what's the metaverse, right? There's all this money going into the metaverse, buying these imaginary assets, right? Assets that only exist in a digital world, but people want them because they're unique, they're scarce, they show something about the individual. Now, people think in the metaverse, those items are going to increase in value, and some of them are get-rich-quick schemes, right? But that concept of buying a digital asset that reflects you in some way, that carries on with you, probably lives on the best in gaming, right? And so what I think you're seeing, to Ankur's point, there used to be a world where you could exclusively pay for in-game advantages, right? But what happened? We moved to a world of massively multiplayer games, and it turns out that it's not that appealing to consumers if you can just pay and get the benefits. So instead, what they did is they said, let's pay for things that have no in-game value, meaning they don't make you any better. They just look nice, right? Your character will have a special trail when they're driving around, right? Your character will have a special outfit. And then to your point from earlier, Polly, you start to look at loot boxes and more of the gacha model of pulling these types of resources. Now you can't even buy that piece of clothing. Now you got to roll a box 60 times in order to get that piece of clothing. And even then, you don't know if you're going to get it, right? And so on one hand, I think you're bringing more access to gaming to more people, and people are starting to make purchases like those virtual bananas, right, that they might not have made before. And at the same time, I think there's this fine line, right, between buying assets and gambling, honestly, right, that I think gaming has to negotiate, right, with every single consumer that it signs up. So I think you're seeing different kinds of business models, from the pay for a game to the free to play with these sort of loot box models. I think you're seeing more people than ever start paying for these types of upgrades. And I think in some ways, it's a precursor for what we should expect, a decade from now in a more virtual world through something like the metaverse.
Yeah, absolutely. I love your point. And I particularly love your point about personalization, because I remember every time I game, it's always making the avatar. That's my favorite part. And if they don't have clothes that I like, I'm not happy about it. So it 100% makes sense. Mehwish, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, sure. So basically, there are these gamers who want to do their personalizations, kids and the family. It's also a family time that happens on the gaming console. All of that said, I think there's another perspective to it where gamers are actually earning, and the brands are paying for it. So you have Ninja, who is a world famous gamer, and he's been financed by BMW, by Red Bull, by Adidas, by Coke, and he takes millions of dollars for one one endorsement that he does. He's also there's skins representing Ninja in Fortnite and PUBG and all these games. So I think there's another perspective where people are also earning out of it, and there's a brand side of it which is also interested in paying for it. So yeah, consumers are there, the skins and the personalization is there, but then there's also a commercial aspect to it, which we cannot ignore.
You know, one of the things that's kind of interesting about that personal aspect is that in some ways, some of these games have transcended the digital world and almost gone into the physical world. Like I remember back in the day, there's games like Team Fortress 2, right? Where you can go and earn these types of items and then you can sell them for US dollars in the real world, right? And so there's those like mega streamers like Ninja and whatnot that can turn this into ad revenue and you know, partnerships and all that kind of stuff. But there's also, I remember as a kid, you know, going and getting some of these items and selling them for $10 and going and using that to go buy something, you know? And so I think you're also starting to see these digital and physical worlds start to come more together as currency becomes sort of interplayable between the two environments.
And I think that was a very important point you raised over there, Ahon, where you mentioned that the game developers, they're making sure that you're spending on cosmetic items. And for me, it was just, you know, why are you buying this skin for $10? Like, why would you spend? It's not going to give you an upgrade. You're not going to be better at the game. But then I realized that, you know, the gamers, they want to dance together in the game, which is just like a social platform for them. They don't want to be on Facebook. They don't want to do WhatsApp. Everything is done on that single platform where they're talking and they're enjoying themselves. They're playing together. They're discussing things. They're showing off. They're updating their statuses. I got this skin and that skin and you don't have it. So I just realized that it is actually a platform of extreme gratification. And hence, payment makes sense for these gamers.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. So moving on then, what are the current major payment trends we're seeing within gaming at the moment? It's a bit more of a wide scoping question, but what kind of trends are we seeing? Ahon, why don't we go for you first for that one?
Yeah, sure. I would say two of them we just talked about, right? One, which is that games are starting to extend into the physical world, right? There's layers to it. The most basic is stuff like, hey, I can turn these games and go sell them online. The developer will earn something, I'll earn something, right? The next layer is I can go sell the items I make in the games. But pretty soon what you're going to start to see is maybe the currency that you use in the game, you can start to use in real life. Maybe stuff that you do in real life will earn you currency in the game, right? And those two things will start to come closer together. So that's one. The second one is that people expect a personalized experience, whether that's your financial product, whether that's your games that you're playing, right? I want something that is unique to me because it makes me feel special, right? And to Mehwish's point, I ultimately am willing to go and pay for something there. And gamers are great at rationalizing, right? So they sit down and they go, you know what? $10 for this imaginary thing sounds crazy, but if I just went and got a drink at a bar, it would be $12. I finished that in 10 minutes and I'm going to use this skin for 30 hours, right? What a great use of money, right? And so you're going to see, one, people start to spend more and more in that regard. And two, people want to create these personal experiences. And then three, I think you're going to start to see more and more people that you wouldn't think game, right? Today, the phone that I have can run a AAA game, right? That I can consistently play no matter where I am, right? My grandma can go play a game if she wants. And with things like the pandemic, more and more of us are stuck inside our homes, right? And so as you said, the only way of really interacting is through these digital worlds. And in a world where VR is still a ways off and so is AR, right? The closest thing to doing activities together is this. And so I think those are three of the trends that you're going to start seeing in the space.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Ankur, what about you? What are your thoughts?
I really agree with that point around how gamers are looking at playing to earn within the game itself. I think what is quite interesting and unique here is if you think of games like Axie Infinity, if you look at the amount of revenues or just the economy of Axie Infinity itself, it's actually bigger than some of the biggest game studios that exist. Like the economy of Axie Infinity is bigger than some game studios like Zynga, which I think got acquired for a couple of tens of billions of dollars. So what's interesting is it's not just people, like to take Ahon's example, it's not just you earning an item within the game and then transferring to someone and having an off-the-game economy where you are paying somebody to acquire an item that was acquired through skill or reputation within the game, and then you transfer to somebody else. But it is the mechanics of like earning are built into the game itself. I think that's quite interesting in how that's coming about. But also when you think of all of the attention that the metaverse is getting, after you've been in virtual reality for a while, like the novelty wears off. Like you need things to do within that virtual reality. And so what's interesting again there is like how we've been talking about within games, people like customizing their characters. You know, first thing you do is customize your avatar. What do you do once you're in virtual reality? How do you hang out? So I think it's also going to play a huge amount of influence within the whole metaverse space. I think how metaverse itself plays out, and you know, to be seen. Like, you know, we've seen virtual reality get resurrected again and again and again, sort of like every 5 years, with a different sort of like spin. It's finally, we got it. And I think it's, there's this probably aspects of like, you know, would that be better once you start considering augmented reality? But I think those are the thoughts that stand out. Like, I think play to earn games have like an interesting sort of take on how you can also not just look at, hey, I'm spending $10 and I'm getting so much value out of it compared to $10 that I spend at a bar in a drink that I finish in 15 minutes, but also in incentivizing people to spend more time in that in-game environment itself.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And then Mehwish, what did you think on this one?
Okay, I'm gonna turn the conversation around how things are in the development market, because you know, we look at US, UK, and you know, the payment trends and the way people are spending, and the access to technology that they have. It's massive, right? But we look at the developing market like Pakistan, where the options are limited, but they're going at a very, very fast pace. So I'm going to look at the type of platform people are using to bring in a payment trend. So for example, a lot of these consoles or PC gamers within our country they're very enthusiastic about gaming, and hence they use, and most of them use the plastic card. And then there are these younger generation, the post-millennial generation, which I would call it. They are more inclined towards Apple Pay and Google Pay. And then within the market that we are in, if you look at any developing nation, most of them are cash-based economies. So you have access of a lot of these game cards and battle passes within stores, and you can online order it on platforms like Daraz, which is owned by Alibaba, by the way. So that kind of this is a major trend within our country, within our gaming ecosystem. And then I see that when you talk about crypto, or when you talk about the digital economy, it also is dependent on the geography you're in. So within US, it is an acceptable currency. Within our country, it is not accepted. It is not a legal currency, which basically brings us to limited options. Yet I'm very excited to see the rate of adoption of this. So we have people who 30% of the people who have a mobile device or a smartphone have access to gaming, and they're involved with playing. Out of that, about 78% of them are involved in gaming on all three platforms: the PC, the consoles, and mobile gaming. So I see that the trend within the developing country is very much dependent on, one, the regulations and the acceptance of the currency, and then how fast the ecosystem is evolving.
I think you raised a really, really interesting point there, because I think a lot of the mechanisms in games that require payments often are built around online gameplay or things that need internet connectivity. And it's not a question of like whether the the developing countries have internet connectivity, but it's the quality of that internet connectivity. So obviously, like, lag and how often you can be online can be a factor in what sort of experiences you can participate in. And I think you're also equally right, having lived in Southeast Asia for a long time, you see the same thing with mobile recharges. You don't do plastic credit cards. Like the credit card penetration is really low. So while there's a sector of that market which does have, say, Apple phones and Apple Pay and the ability to pay in-game, I think it does exclude a huge portion of the market that does not have plastic cards. And so I think you raise a really interesting point on how a lot of physical retail gets blended in, where you might get a physical scratch card for a voucher that then allows you to go buy stuff. But how much attention are game studios paying on that kind of distribution in these emerging markets?
Yeah, because sorry. Okay, so basically within our country, the adoption of telecom and the penetration of telecom is very high, and which is why one of the key payment methods within Pakistan is the mobile top-ups and the mobile wallets. And they are working fantastically well with the majority of the population who does not have access to high-end smartphones. So you find, the corner Kriana store uncle playing some, game on his mobile phone, which basically he got from a market for $50 because it's a second-hand Samsung phone, and he has access to it. So which is fantastic to look at, because he's very much interested and he has the mobile top-up facility to buy stuff within the game. That's very interesting and to look at.
For sure. I think another thing that's interesting in what you're saying is that you're talking about cryptocurrency and the acceptance of cryptocurrency in different areas, right? Even though cryptocurrency is an accepted form of payment, whether you're buying the game's currency in Pakistan, you're buying the game's currency in the UK, you're buying it in the US, you're buying the same game's currency, right? It's almost this accepted thing that this virtual currency that the game has created, which is almost, again, the precursor to cryptocurrencies in some ways, right? Digital assets that hold some kind of value that can buy things that are interchangeable between different environments. You're starting to see that games create their own currency, right? And that currency has its own intrinsic value, that people across the world, no matter whether you're loading up with cash or you're loading up with a plastic card or you're topping up through the iTunes store, they can interchange those funds with each other, right? So if Ankur is in Pakistan and he goes and he's playing on his phone and I'm playing on my phone here and I buy with Apple and he buys with cash, we can still send money to each other. Whereas if I want to send money to Ankur, otherwise it's going to be a nightmare, right? I'm going to have to go to some place, remit money over to Pakistan. He's going to have to go to a bank and get it, right? And so in some ways, you could argue that games are bringing people across the country closer together in that way, and allowing dollars to rupees or any other currency exchange by medium of this sort of centralized gaming currency, right? Which I think is really interesting, because in some ways it supersedes borders, right? And it supersedes traditional regulations because it's not a real currency, but it is a mode of transfer of value, right? So I think that's a really interesting point you make.
Yeah, and just sort of latching on to that very last thing you said, Ahon, about like regulation, especially now we're talking about different countries. How much does sort of regulation have in terms of like PayTech adoption in gaming? And I guess carrying on the conversation from what we've just talked about, how much does the global aspect of the gaming industry affect payments, and like does it bring challenges? Because I mean, even speaking on the panel today, I know we're all over the world. So what impact does that have on payments within gaming? Mehwish, why don't we start with you?
So like I said, so the government regulations are a big part of it. And if your country is not recognizing the currency, then that there is a lag there, right? However, another way to look at it is the acceptance of that currency within the country, by the people of the country. So if you have a bunch of people who are into that ecosystem, they are using the gaming platform, like Ahon mentioned, to exchange, to send money to each other, to send value to each other of some sort. I think then it becomes important for the regulations to change and to adopt and to go with the change, because if not, then you will be left behind. And the rate of change is so fast. Change is inevitable. It's going to happen anyways, right? But right now, in the last 2 years, post-pandemic, it's so fast that we cannot think and figure out if we should be doing that or if she should be still thinking and evaluating the risks of money laundering and converting the black money into white or controlling the inflation. It's going to happen, right? So it depends on how fast the decision makers are going to take an action.
Fantastic. Ahon, I'd love to bring you in on this one. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. I think Mehwish is spot on, right? And I think first of all, regulation is always chasing society, right? They're always trying to figure out what's happening and then how do we go and regulate it. And to Mehwish's point, over the last couple of years, a lot has changed from a financial perspective, right? You have companies offering bank accounts. You have new kinds of currency that aren't fiat currency. You have games bringing people across the country and across the world closer together, right? And you have the money movement rails that run the world changing, right? Which hasn't really happened over the course of most of our lives, right? And so I think one thing that's interesting is, as Mehwish says, that space is almost outpacing the changes in regulation. And so you start to play that out. And just as she said, what happens? Well, there is a sub-economy that exists here, right? And what regulators are going to look at are a couple of things. One, they're going to look at how is money coming in, right? So we just talked about a bunch of different ways: cash load, prepaid, mobile, top-ups, all that kind of stuff, right? So how do you regulate money coming in? How do you prevent people from doing things you don't want to incentivize? So for example, in the United States, right, gambling isn't something that is looked too favorably upon when you're looking online, right? And so there are rules around the kinds of things you can and can't do inside of these games. So you'll see that kind of regulation. But there is a third area that is going to prove pretty hard to regulate, right? And that is going to be something that over time, especially as the metaverse becomes more popular and becomes more of a thing, people are going to have to figure out how to regulate, which is, I've gotten money into this ecosystem. Okay. And the way that I got it in was fine. But then what did I do with it? Right? Then how did that money move around? How did I spend it with other people? What were those other people doing? And the reason that this is so hard is because there are millions of people making transactions at any given time. In a digital world, sometimes you're divorcing identity from the transaction, right? And so you don't know who is making the transaction, which is a really important part of digital payments, right? And because you can make 10 transactions in the span of a few seconds, right, you can move money very quickly to the point where it's hard to go and trace it back. Even if you have an audit trail of every single transaction, who is going to sit down and look at 10 million users in every transaction they have ever made to go figure out what's happening? Nobody, right? And so what you're going to see, and this is going to be a challenge, what you're going to see is regulation have to start to look at alternative ways of understanding data, right? So what is something that can look at 10 million records and all of that stuff and figure it out? AI, right? But I say AI and I say regulation, and those two concepts are almost incongruent, right? You can't imagine those two things happening together. But how else are you going to look at tens of millions, billions, if you look across the world, of people and all of their internal transactions? So I think you're seeing that, one, there is going to be regulation as different types of payments bring funds into the ecosystem. There is going to be regulation onto the types of things that people can buy. But the most challenging piece is going to be regulating how these sub-economies work as currency moves to be more digital, as things like cryptocurrency change up the game, and as consumers start to raise their expectations.
Amazing, for sure. And then Ankur, what did you think on this one?
I'll take a slightly different tack on the regulation piece. I think the payment piece is quite open as an ecosystem when you think of PC gaming or other platforms. I think, but by far the largest volume is obviously through Apple Store and Google Play Store. And one interesting piece that regulators have been picking up on is the 30%, tax essentially that Apple and Google place on this. Obviously, some of them are moving it in certain directions. And this is exactly why Epic, ran into the sort of lawsuit with Apple to try and figure out what that sort of tax or commission that goes to the people who run the app stores should be. And so it's an interesting development because it's not just happening in that Epic Games versus Apple lawsuit in the US, but the same thing was picked up by Dutch regulators in Europe, which can obviously set a precedent within the European Union. There's a similar case that happened in South Korea as well. Most of the time, the regulators are coming down and saying, no, you need to not lock them into only the in-game the sort of in-app payment system that you've built within your ecosystem. You have to offer choice. What interests me is, like, very recently, within the past week, after the Dutch regulator told Apple that you have to go offer choice to, in this case, it was not gaming, but it was dating services, Apple said, fine, we'll take 27% instead, which is just moving it to say, we'll give you a discount of 3% because that's probably what you pay in card, processing card fees anyway. But we'll keep the rest as 27%. And by the way, there's very, very intense auditing that we'll do to prove how much you're collecting through those other mechanisms. So I think this in itself is going to be an interesting showdown that happens. What happens if the regulators come down harshly and say, no, you have to offer choice of other payment formats within the game, while maintaining perhaps the same level of security that is offered by the Google Pay and Apple Pay systems. But how do you offer choice to the game developers? Will game developers then pass on some of that savings to their customers, or do they just keep the difference as additional profits that they currently don't realize? So I think that in itself is going to be an interesting space as far as regulation is concerned, and see how that sort of like plays out. I think it will be a very interesting 2 years in the PayTech space as far as gaming is concerned.
I think
fantastic. Oh, sorry, Ahon, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, there's an interesting question there too. How can Apple afford to charge 27-30% for that? Because it's way easier than the alternatives, right? Because as Mehwish was saying, if I have to go to a store and buy a card and enter that card and like turn cash basically into this, I've spent 3 days trying to get $10 into this game, right? Whereas if I can just push a button and there's money in my account, right? That's way easier and that's worth a premium, right? And so on one hand, you're thinking, hey, it costs 3% to make a credit card transaction, it costs 30% to make an Apple Store transaction. But on the other side, look inward, right? It's so hard for someone to put money into your ecosystem that is a really appealing option. I think one thing we're seeing in the United States is games are starting to wonder, hey, should I create like an internal wallet? Because if you could just instantly transfer money from your bank account and it showed up, right? That's equally easy, right? And if suddenly that gets you 10% more coins or 10% more crystals or whatever the currency is, yeah, I'm going to do that, right? The gamer wants value, right? The gamer is that rationalizing entity. And so if these companies, Epic Games, Blizzard, etc., if they can create a way for people to easily get money into their ecosystem and turn it into the digital currency without having to use the Apple Store, that is what is going to push down margins. Because otherwise, Apple owns your game, right? They own how you're getting money and they know it. And so they're going to charge you 30% for it, just as they do on the App Store, because they know if there was no App Store, you would sell no apps, right? And so I think, to your point, that showdown is going to partially involve these companies trying to figure out, how do I make it easier to get money in here so that it's actually even easier and you can earn even more than you would get going over the App Store, Apple Store rails. That'll push down margins, that'll get better results for gamers. So I'm excited to see that too.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of leads into my next question slightly. And what are sort of key aspects of payments within gaming? Like, what are some key features that should be there? And I'm sure we'll all throw out some sort of keywords like frictionless, streamlined, or instant, as you were just saying, Ahon. But what are key features of payments within gaming, and why are they so important? So Ankur, I'm going to come to you for this one first.
Streamlined and frictionless is exactly right. I think there's, as games have, as Ahon mentioned, there's almost a sort of casino-y or gambling type aspect to it, with when you get loot boxes or when you get variable rewards, you buy something, you don't exactly know what you're getting out of it. I think as that has become more common, I think games are moving towards where you want to reduce that point where you question yourself, should I really buy this? And hit tap and the payment just goes through. I think there's an aspect of that which games are trying to optimize for, which is how if you then throw them to a web page where they have to fill out their credit card details and their address and their postal code and stuff like that, they might already go away and say it's not worth my time. So it's about making that process as frictionless as possible. This is, I think, a second piece of regulation that will come in, or which the regulators around the world will start paying attention to, which is does this fall under gambling laws? How are they protecting people who are under the age of 18, perhaps, and maybe running up huge bills on their parents' credit cards or their parents' mobile phone bills? And is there enough, work being done on, perhaps checking the identity of the players to assess whether they fall under this sort of vulnerable category? So, for example, at least within the UK, but also in a lot of jurisdictions, there are laws that make gambling companies responsible to stop players if they've been losing too much money in one go, or if they've been spending too much money in one go and they're on a losing streak. You can, in most of the banks within the UK, you can put yourself voluntarily within your banking app to say, please block me from gambling transactions. And if you want to lift that, then you have to go through a process where you have to explain to them, well, this is the reason why I want to take it off. So it almost puts in that roadblocks to that frictionless experience. So I think frictionless experiences are great. Obviously, it makes the in-game experience a lot smoother. But there's also a check and balance that needs to come in at the same time on, if you make it too frictionless for every single audience that's out there, that's not necessarily the best outcome. And I think the smartest sort of game studios will try and self-regulate themselves before actual regulation gets brought in. Because if they can self-regulate and show they're taking that care to look at who's below 18, are they trying to circumvent these blocks for who's below 18? Are we looking at perhaps the profile of the players and ensuring that we safeguard the people who might be on a losing streak, to preempt perhaps regulation coming in from the government itself? I think that is one place where the streamline and frictionless will go in the other direction.
Amazing, thank you. And Ahon, what did you have to add on this one?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting dynamic as well, because from the game company's perspective, it's like telling your best customers to stop spending money, right? It's like being Starbucks and someone comes and buys a coffee and an hour later is like, hey, can I get a coffee? And they're like, whoa, you've already had one coffee today. Like, you can chill. And they're like, who are you to tell me how much coffee I can have, right? Because in this space, it's not that they're like, in most cases, it's not that they're spending the money and gambling on something and maybe they win and maybe they don't. There's definitely those use cases, but most of the time it's, I'm spending a ludicrous amount of money trying to get this loot box for this item that I want, right? But if you have someone who's gone and spent $500 trying to get a loot box, chances are they probably could use a break. But how do you have that conversation with them in a way that keeps them coming back, in a way that's responsible, to Ankur's point, right? Because if you think about it, another thing that's a key aspect of payments in gaming is disintermediating it from your fiat currency. Here's what I mean. If I go spend $10, right, in a game, are they going to give me 1,000 credits? No, because that would make the math way too easy. Right? They're going to give me 974 credits, right? Because over time, I'm going to lose this association between how much money have I actually spent on this game, right? I know I've spent crystals. I keep topping up my crystals and whatever, spending it on stuff, but how much have I spent, right? And so I think a big part of it, because especially in the US, where, people are really, they feel some type of way about their ability to purchase things, right? I should be able to buy whatever I want to buy, right? I think the first step to that regulation is going to be giving people visibility into how much they've spent, right? Today, if I go to any of the games that I play and I try and see payment history, nobody will show it to me, right? They'll show me you've bought these things, right? But they won't tell me how much have I spent, right? And that's on purpose, right? It's the same reason that there's no clocks when you go to Las Vegas, right? They don't want you to know what time it is, right? And so I think that's one of the challenges in the gaming industry, where on one hand, you want to make it easy to create these sub currencies, and so that you can keep money in your ecosystem and you can create that sub economy. On the other hand, you got to do it in a responsible way where the individuals know how much they're spending, because otherwise you can end up in a world. I mean, I saw an article like just yesterday about this father whose daughter spent $20,000 on a game in the course of a day. And now he has to go and try and fight that gaming company to get it back, because of course he didn't know that was going to happen, right? And so I think that's going to be an interesting dynamic. Like, how do you tell your best customers to stop spending money? How do you get rid of the fundamental way that keeps money into the ecosystem, but then still keep your ecosystem growing and driving value?
Yeah, for sure. And then Mehwish, I'd love to bring you in on this one, particularly maybe from like a consumer perspective. What do you think on this?
I just like to add here that we had a V-Bucks situation yesterday where 2,000 V-Bucks were gone, and there was chaos in the house where my older son, he was just like, like the little one, he spent it and there's just 200 left and we have a battle pass. I needed that. And so like you guys mentioned, that it's very important to control that bit. And it's very important to control the same spenders. I'm referring to my husband here, to look at what he's doing, because for him, during that situation where there's a one-on-one going on and he needs that power up and that particular armor to win that game, the seamlessness of that experience, of that payment experience, has to be there, because he needs to press that button and he needs to make sure that he wins. Otherwise, he's going to start paying again and it's going to be 4 hours gone again. So for an in-game experience, payments have to be seamless, because it's a very high involvement, high energy, emotional state of a human being who's involved in that game. For him, seamlessness of the experience is very important. However, the V-Buck situations also needs to be controlled and looked at more responsibly. I don't know, I'm lost on words over there, that how can we control that? And once we figure that out, I'd want to know from you guys, what controls did you put that I'm missing out on? And maybe we can work on that bit together.
Absolutely. I mean, this very kind of tenuously links into my next question when it comes to sort of security risks within payments and gaming. So are there any fraud and security risks associated with payments in games? And if so, how are companies reassuring gamers that their payments are secure? I guess maybe not in the instance of kids spending all your money, but in other, fraudsters and other cyber criminals. So Mehwish, why don't I come back to you on this one?
Okay, so I'd say security means different things to different people in different economies, right? For a more established brand like Sony or Microsoft, they've made sure that the payment systems available on their consoles or their softwares is acceptable regardless of the geography. So if I'm sitting anywhere in the world, I'll be able to make payments over there. For the rest of the economy, the rest of the ecosystem, they are dependent on innovations by Google Pay and Apple Pay, right? And I feel that for a developing country like Pakistan, offline payments is what they call safe, right? For them, it's just the most convenient way of getting things done in the most secure and safe manner, right? So I feel that which I'm just wondering, like payments, the companies like Razer, how long till they start competing with Google and Apple to basically come up with a more in-game, in-payment experience?
Fantastic. And so Ahon, what did you think on this one?
Yeah, I would take a slightly different approach on who's going to get into gaming. I think Razer is really interesting, right? But then the challenge becomes the same, which is how do you get distribution into these gaming companies? I think you're going to see the flip, right? Where gaming companies realize, wait a minute, I have 50 million people who play this game, right? Like I effectively run an economy. Why am I not the one who's taking these payments? Why am I not the one who's opening a wallet? Why am I not the one who's formalizing this sub-economy, right? And so I think what you're going to see over the next 5 years is a lot of these games starting to facilitate that function. Back to your other question around security, I think there's two big pieces of it. One, which is the consumer's perception of security, right? Because that's important. And then two, which is managing fraud, right? And I'm really curious to hear Ankur's points on this one too. On the former, right? When you go and spend money online in a game, they're showing you something to make you feel like it's safe, right? Maybe it's a little lock that shows PCI DSS compliance, right? Maybe it's powered by whatever, right? But to Mehwish's point, if it's not in cash and I'm not turning it into a card that I can then go spend, and I'm putting my credit card information on an online website, you better convince me that this is going to be safe or I'm not giving you my money, because I've heard all those horror stories about, credit card numbers getting stolen, turning it into transactions, et cetera. So from a UI UX perspective, that's a really critical piece. The second piece of it though is real fraud, right? I think one of the things that we talked about earlier in today's discussion is that identity is not as fixed in a digital world as it is in a physical world, right? But in a physical world, whether or not you made the transaction is the biggest determinant of whether or not it's fraud, right? So in that second environment, if Mehwish, your son came and said, yeah, my younger brother did some fraud, you know what I mean? He went and he purchased this thing, it totally didn't mean for him to do it. Is that really fraud? Well, I think the game company would say no, right? They know you guys are part of a family unit, you knew what you were spending, you went and you spent it, right? But your son may go and submit a fraud claim, right? And so from a company's perspective, there's a really unique thing that you got to figure out, which is even if the person who made the payment isn't the person who normally plays this game, it doesn't mean that it's fraudulent, right? And in reverse, even if it looks like the person is the one who's making the transaction, it doesn't mean it isn't fraudulent, right? And so what you'll start to see there is beyond, financial compliance things like PCI and all that stuff, you will also start to see two-factor authentication, right? So if you buy a lot of currency, you'll get that text on your phone that says, hey, is this really you that's going out and purchasing this, right? Or you'll have to enter a secondary code that you got on your email, right? I think you'll start to see those types of things become more and more prevalent as identity becomes disintermediated, as digital economies become more popular, as this becomes an alternative way for people to spend money. And tying back to your regulation question from earlier, I think it'll be really interesting to see how regulation considers identity in the context of digital gaming. But Ankur, I'm curious to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, massively agree with all of those points. I think the security piece is exactly the argument that Apple and Google and a lot of the platform gatekeepers use to say that's why we deserve that 30%, because we offer, it's almost a tax on like having the Apple Pay symbol and that padlock icon and convincing people that this is secure. Is that worth 30%? Probably not, because we don't pay 30% for the same features when we shop online. But I think identity is one of these pieces that massively plays in here. To that point, one of the ways that in which value is extracted out of stolen credit cards is you go buy a voucher for Uber, you go buy an iTunes gift card, you go buy V-Bucks or Robux, and you go and transfer that account out. And because these ecosystems are not as sophisticated in monitoring financial crime as perhaps banks and credit card processing companies are, it's easy to wash that sort of money out. Now, I think one of the places where perhaps gaming or in-game currencies haven't been as big in this kind of money laundering is it's hard to go back out into fiat currency. But as cryptocurrency or some crypto aspects start coming more into gaming payments, I think that's another space where regulators will pay more attention. A lot of cryptocurrency projects are relatively it's in random jurisdictions. Perhaps you don't know who are the creators behind it. A lot of game creators are known. You have to go through that identity and due diligence check when you go publish on Google, when you go publish on the Apple App Stores. So they will probably be easier for a regulator to go after. So I think as crypto becomes more part of the gaming transactions, it also becomes easier for people to lose their in-game currency perhaps. And if it goes away, then there's harder to retrace and gain it back. But it also might start playing more of a role in what's the angle here on how some of the bad actors in the ecosystem might use that to wash money or money launder. So yeah, completely agree with some of the points that Ahon brought up.
Perfect, fantastic, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our time today, but I just want to ask you all one more very, very quick question before we go. And basically, what's the future going to look like? Where are we headed? Whether that's in the next, 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, 10 years, very quickly, what do you guys think the future is going to hold? Ankur, let's go for you first.
I think the future is going to also look more towards experiences where the music industry is moving. So people want slow experiences. People have started buying vinyls because they want to support the artist directly and they know it's going to them and not the streaming platform. So I think there's going to be a very interesting move in that direction. And I think any kind of mixed reality or augmented reality is going to become very, very interesting in how games and payments within games can be blended in with the real world. And that is probably one of the most exciting aspects that I'm looking forward to.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Mehwish, what do you think on the future?
Okay, so for me, I think the future is commerce. And if you are a game developer, you need to think of yourself as a fintech. Plan and establish your company, your design, your structures, your organization as if you're a fintech. Because like Ankur mentioned, the entire fiasco of Apple and Epic Games, one is trying to make their own payment system within their in-app experiences, right? And then there's Apple who wants to make sure that the 30% keeps on coming in, and they become nice and they make it 27%. All that said, I feel that crypto is rising at such a fast pace. It might become the currency of the gaming world. Commerce at the end of the day is going to be a part of everything. So gamification is what's happening on your grocery store app, your gaming app, your banking app for that matter. It's just taking over the entire commerce platform. And when I say commerce, it's offline and online, and online both. So for me, it's definitely gamification of commerce.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And then Ahon, finally, your thoughts on the future, please.
Yeah, sure. I'll give you three. The first one is that I think games will extend from the virtual world into the physical world. One of those ways is going to be by, those wallets that earn you game points for real life things, or allow you to use game points in real life scenarios, right? But you're going to see those worlds start to blend together. And you're also going to see the principles of gaming, as Mehwish was saying, making their way to finance, making their way to other aspects of the world, because that delight, the dopamine hit that comes from getting what you want in that loot box is something that you can replicate across a number of different verticals in other areas, right, to drive engagement. And as engagement becomes the key thing that people are fighting for, you're going to see those principles making their way across to drive stickiness and retention. So number one, they're going to extend it to the physical world. Number two is virtual currencies are going to become more useful, right? We all saw the Microsoft acquisition of that gaming portfolio for such a large sum of money, right? Until now, all of those games existed in silos. But if you think about the concept of the metaverse, what makes it useful is you can port that identity, port those funds from world to world to world to world, right? And they start to become a universe, right? As opposed to a planet, right? And so just as Microsoft acquires that set of assets, you might be able to use money that you use in Halo in other games that are coming from their new portfolio, right? You might be able to use those currencies out in the real world, right? Because you'll see these large companies with huge player bases start to create their own economies, right? And that's going to create creator economies, right? We were talking about people who monetize this as their main source of revenue. I think you're going to see people who do streaming like the ninjas of the world, but you also see people who create content as games start to democratize how they build out and how they grow. So that's the second one, is virtual currencies will become more useful. And then the third one is that I think, as Ankur was saying, you're going to see games push into artificial reality and virtual reality. And the big thing that's going to determine how quickly that goes is how quickly people adopt AR and VR, right? Because if you're getting nausea as you have this massive headset and a wire, you're probably not going to use it, right? But if it's super easy, you pop it on, you can see all of your friends, you definitely will, right? And so as you have the digital and physical worlds coming together, advancements like AR, VR will actually take gaming and bring it into that metaverse and allow them to seamlessly bridge into that concept and help get society there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ahon, and to the rest of you as well. Unfortunately, that does bring us to the end of our webinar today. I just wanted to say a big thank you for our online audience for watching. Don't forget that you can follow along the conversation with the hashtag Fintech Times Adopt PayTech, and you can follow us at the Fintech Times on Twitter. And thank you so much to my panelists, Ahon, Ankur, and Mehwish. It's been fantastic to have you here. I have absolutely loved our conversation and hearing all of your insights. So thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope I see you again very, very soon.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Fintech Times podcast. We hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as we did. Don't forget to check us out at thefintechtimes.com and subscribe to our monthly publication to keep up to date with all the latest fintech news.